And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of the Philistines, and they crushed and oppressed the children of Israel. In the Old Testament, the name Philistine appears repeatedly in an ongoing chronicle of hostility. Portrayed as thieves and idolaters, the Philistines are accused of stealing the Ark of the Covenant and worshipping Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies. From the hulking Goliath to the treacherous Delilah, they are, without exception, depicted as a rather nasty bunch. As if the biblical definition of Philistine was not bad enough, the term took on a second life in 1693. In the German university town of Jena, a classic town and gown brawl between drunken students and local workmen provoked the university chaplain's rage. He declared that the townspeople's attack on the God-fearing young students revealed them to be crude, uneducated, and no better than Philistines. Since then, the term Philistine instantly brands one as boorish, backwards, and uncultured. Who were the Philistines? Why did they get such a bad reputation? And why, after thriving for 6 centuries, did they simply disappear? When David slew Goliath, according to the immortal biblical story, the brutish Philistines turned tail and fled. The righteous wrath of the Israelites drove them all the way to the gates of the city of Ekron. Today, some 3,000 years later, it is the archaeologists who are pursuing the Philistines back to the gates of their city. Here, 20 miles to the west of Jerusalem, they are searching for the historical counterpart to the scriptural people who harassed the Israelites for so many generations. Ekron is frozen in time. Shards of Philistine pottery still litter the ground. The site is enormous. 3 digs strewn across 85 acres trace the existence of the Philistines from their very first appearance in the Holy Land.
We chose this particular site of Tel Mikne Ekron because we hoped that it would produce the archaeological raw materials that would give us some new insights into who the Philistines were, where they came from, how they developed, and of course the ultimate question, why they disappeared from the pages of history.
The artifacts throw new light on the Old Testament, telling of coexistence as well as conflict, and breathing life into a very different people than we know from the Bible.
First of all, they have a terrible reputation. If I tell you you're a Philistine, you would not take it as a compliment. It's to be crude, uncultured, and so on. But I think what we really managed to show through archaeology, that they had a very high culture.
Trudy Dotan and Cy Gitting direct the joint American-Israeli excavations at Ekron, which have been going on for more than a decade. Dotan, of the Hebrew University, is looking into the Philistines' elusive beginnings. Cy Gitting, of the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research, is reconstructing their equally mystifying last days. Together, their work tells a surprisingly touching tale of strangers in a strange land, refugees who survived, flourished, and then disappeared from a world that did not welcome them. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines were one of several groups of sea peoples who invaded and settled in Palestine in the land of Canaan, from where they struck out at the Israelites throughout Old Testament times. They inhabited 5 city-states on the plains of Philistia: Ashdod, Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. But it was Ekron that bordered the Israelite stronghold of Judea,
And we wanted a city where the peoples would come together and we could see the clash of cultures to test the influence of one culture on another. And as you look out here to the east, you can see the high hills of Judah. So you can feel the frontier nature of the city as we stand right here on the border between ancient Philistia and ancient Judea.
For centuries, historians and biblical scholars have speculated on the origins of the Philistines and the other sea peoples described in the Bible. The answer would be found not in the sands or the scripture of the Holy Land, but in the writings of an Egyptian pharaoh. This is the temple of Medinet Habu in Egypt. The great sea battles pictured here have long baffled scholars. Who were the people the Egyptians fought and captured, and when? The monuments remained mute for almost 3,000 years. Then, in 1829, the famed linguist Jean-Francois Champollion arrived at the ruins of Thebes and translated these hieroglyphs. He determined that the temple belonged to an Egyptian pharaoh named Ramses III and depicted his victory over an invading force of strange seafaring people. Of the 3 sets of prisoners being led off, Champollion managed to translate one of the names just before his death in 1832. These hieroglyphs spelled out the identity of the captured warriors. They were the Philistines.
The reliefs on the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramses III are really one of the most exciting sources of learning how the sea people, the Philistines, looked physically, especially their weapons, their headgear, and so on. The ships of the Philistines have beaks which look like heads of birds, and the motive of the bird is reoccurring in their art.
The first excavations of Philistine sites in the Holy Land turned up pottery with the same kinds of distinctive, stylized birds. At first, archaeologists assumed it had been imported from somewhere in the Aegean. It was almost identical to the exquisite ceramics created by the Minoans on the island of Crete and the Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland. But analysis of the clays used showed that the pottery had been made locally. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. It now seemed that the Philistines' journey to the Holy Land could be traced all the way back to ancient Greece. But what force could have driven them from their homelands to settle in as foreign and unwelcoming a place as the plains of Philistia? The Egyptian hieroglyphs, the first appearance of the Philistines in the Bible, and the earliest evidence of their settlement in Israel all date from the same time, around 1200 BC. Archaeology has revealed this to be a period of profound upheaval throughout the Mediterranean. Although its causes are unclear, some sort of catastrophe had torn the closely woven fabric of society throughout the Mediterranean.
When we are in the 12th century, we're in a very, very exciting period. We call it a crisis period. Around 1200 BC, suddenly there is a disaster. We don't know exactly what happened. Trade ended. Great cities like Mycenae, the Mycenaean Empire, were destroyed. The Hittite Empire was destroyed. Canaanite cities were destroyed. So there is a picture of something happening.
These waves of destruction left their mark here as well. Below the Philistine layers of Ekron lie the charred remains of a small Canaanite city that fell in the terrible collapse of the 12th century BC.
Well, when we go up to this corner, we see here a really wonderful destruction of mud bricks, slanting, as you can see here, burnt red and black. There were wooden beams, there were store jars filled with figs. And when we see this, we really get a feeling of the city totally destroyed by fire.
It now appears that in the midst of the chaos, the Philistines fled the Aegean in search of a new homeland. After their loss to the Egyptians, they retreated or were deported to the plains between Judea and the sea. The real genius of the Philistines, now emerging from the ruins, is an ability to make the best of a bad situation. In keeping with their Greek heritage, they transformed Ekron into a flourishing city-state. The oldest Philistine artifacts being unearthed reveal a people who took pride in their artistry and craftsmanship. Clay figurines from these earliest layers of Philistine settlement also show that the sea peoples had worshipped a goddess, similar to those found throughout Aegean and Mycenaean communities.
She's very, very special. She's highly stylized. She has this very long neck, bird face, the high, kind of wide headdress, and she only has breasts, and she very conveniently becomes a couch. So it's a very unique thing, and parallels to her are really only known in the Aegean world. So it is a new feature that the Philistines bring with them, remembering cult that is connected with fertility, with women. She must have become quite prominent because we find many fragments of her.
This delightful jug seems to show a decidedly un-Philistine appreciation of music in their religious ceremonies. The archaeological record is clear. As strangers, the Philistines thrived in their new world. The secret of their success was a mastery of metalworking. In particular, their skill at forging iron weapons. The book of Samuel relates how, when it came time to do battle, the Philistines soundly defeated the Israelites, slaying 4,000 men. The Israelites feared the iron swords of the Philistines. A ceremonial knife found at Ekron shows a Philistine deftness with both iron and bronze far in advance of any of their neighbors.
And it's put in a handle made of ivory. It is extremely important because metal, and especially the coming of iron, has been connected with the power of the Philistines. And we do know they had a monopoly of metalworking.
That monopoly of metalworking enabled the Philistines to prosper. Even the Israelites depended on them for their agricultural tools. The refugees did not remain an isolated culture. These Judean-style four-horned altars and Egyptian-type burial masks suggest the Philistines embraced many of the religious customs and artistic styles of their new neighbors. But after 2 centuries, fate once again intervened. In about 1000 BC, some great reversal of fortune descended upon the Philistines. Ekron was destroyed. Afterwards, the Philistines returned and rebuilt, but abandoned most of their sprawling city. Ekron became a small, fortified town. Who destroyed the city? According to the Old Testament, it was an avenging Israelite army. For 3 centuries, Ekron remained a ghost of its former self. But the Philistines would prove themselves remarkably resilient. Around 700 BC, another conqueror swept through Philistia, this time the Assyrians. Ironically, their colonization of Ekron revitalized it. Sai Gittin says the new prosperity resulted from the city's key location in what he describes as the world's first common market.
At the end of the 8th century, there was a major international revolution. The Assyrians really created the first classical empire in history. And throughout the eastern Mediterranean basin, they created colonies, great commercial centers, and for their own reasons, they chose the city of Ekron, a Philistine city, to build the largest industrial center in the ancient Near East for the production of olive oil.
Through their Philistine colony, the Assyrians cornered one of the most precious commodities in the ancient world. With only 3% of the Ekron site excavated, archaeologists have found over 100 olive oil processing plants. At its height, Ekron could have processed 1,000 tons of oil a year to be traded to Egypt for grain and other foodstuffs. Astonishingly, this is almost a quarter of Israel's current output. Cy Gitting calls it an historic transition from cottage industry to mass production.
Walking through the industrial zone, we see one olive oil installation after the other. Area after area. For example, over here, we see this huge crushing basin where the olives were first placed, and then a stone roller was rolled over the olives, and the pulp was then put into baskets stacked on top of these vats or presses, and then a beam, a wooden beam with the stone weights, these perforated stone weights that you can see here and here, were used to actually press the remaining oil or juice from the pulp. This is one of the most stupendous industrial belts of any kind ever found in the ancient Near East.
Under the Assyrians, Ekron again grew in size. During their 7th century BC Renaissance, the Philistines also proved to be sophisticated urban planners. They tailored the city to the needs of a new industrial elite.
More towards the center of the site, we have what we call the domestic area where the people apparently lived, and we found courtyards and ovens and cooking areas. And then in the central part of the site, we found what we call the private zone or elite area, where the finest goods, the best construction, the most important finds, our inscriptions, most of our silver caches, all of these things were found.
The excavations also show that Ekron was built according to a step-down plan. The levels of the city descend from the fortified outer perimeter to the residential center. Although the Philistine city had grown wealthy and cosmopolitan under the Assyrians, Gittin believes that the once proud culture of the sea people was diluted by centuries of assimilation. Their Aegean roots of fading memory.
By the 10th century before the Common Era, when they begin to become less important as nation, city-states, and as a people, and their material culture deteriorates, you can see the impact of Phoenicians, of Judeans, and other cultures. So by the time we come to the last century of their existence, that is the 7th century before the Common Era, you will find very little, if anything at all, that you can relate to their material culture as it was back in the 12th century.
Although the Philistine Renaissance was powerful, it would not last. At the end of the 7th century BC, the balance of power was again shifting all around the Mediterranean. The Egyptian pharaoh received an extraordinary letter from the Philistine king Adon. The Babylonians were on the march. Their objective was Egypt. Philistia was in the way. The Philistine king was asking for help.
So this gives us some insight into the minds of the Philistine kings as they knew that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar was approaching Philistia and was prepared to destroy their cities.
But the pharaoh's armies had enough on their hands protecting their own lands. There would be no last-minute reprieve for the Philistines. Recently, Cy Gittin found remarkable evidence of the panic that overtook Ekron as the Babylonians bore down upon them. Secret caches of jewelry, silver, and their treasured metal farm tools.
And you have to ask the reason, why did these people bury some of their most valuable tools and jewelry? I think it's because they knew and they had hoped that once the city was attacked, destroyed, whatever, they would be able to return and to claim their valuables. We have never, ever found one skeleton. Any remains that would indicate that there was anyone in the city when the city was destroyed.
The Philistines may have escaped, but they would never return to their city. They seem to have been utterly wiped from the historical record. Why did a culture that had withstood so many invasions finally disappear? In the end, it may be that the Philistines' greatest strength, adaptability, ironically proved their Achilles' heel. With the fall of Ekron, they had not only lost their home, they had lost their identity. For Trudy Dohan and Sai Gitti, although the ruined metropolis now reverberates with the voices of a vibrant cultured people, they tell a cautionary tale.
Well, we've, I think, all of us who have worked in this period and excavated this site, have come to appreciate their artistic talent, their ability to survive, and perhaps we've learned certain moral lessons from the very fact that they didn't survive. And I think this is a lesson that perhaps has importance today in the 20th century, that groups only last or survive when they are able to maintain a certain core of their own culture, a certain sense of distinctiveness.
Through archaeology, I think we bring them back their reputation, I would say. Now, if we dig the cities of the Philistines, if I tell you, you are a Philistine, it will almost become a compliment.
With most of Ekron yet to be excavated, the Philistines almost certainly have more surprises in store for the archaeologists. The people of Goliath are making yet another comeback, long after their disappearance from the pages of history. What would prove to be the Philistines' ultimate disaster will ironically become a gift to archaeologists some 2,500 years later. After the Babylonian invasion that leveled the city in 603 BC, Ekron was never rebuilt. Today, the ruins of Ekron remain a remarkable testament to the sophistication and resilience of a long maligned people. The Philistines were anything but Philistine.